Hey everybody, now that we have talked about the independent samples t-test and the dependent samples t-test, and we've become familiar with those and how to calculate them and also how to interpret them, we're going to cover the one sample t-test in the same way. We're going to do it relatively briefly. I'm assuming that you've kind of watched the videos in sequence, of course. If you're just getting a refresher, this should be a good video for you, however. What we're going to do in this one is cover the hypotheses, the assumptions, and also the equation and take a look at it. We'll actually calculate a one sample t-test in the next video, and then we'll interpret it in another video. So first, let's put in context what the one sample t-test is. You'll recall that the independent samples t-test has two independent samples, hence the name. Two groups that you sample, and they're separate from each other. They're always kept separate. They have no interaction with one another, for example, because we don't want them influencing each other's scores. A dependent samples design, of course, is instead where both samples actually do influence each other, and sometimes on purpose. In fact, that's a very nice study, a very powerful study. So sometimes you actually design it in that way that the first group is the same as the second group, except for one little intervention that you did, and hopefully everything else is controlled for. Okay, that's a very powerful test. Now, a one sample test, however, collects only one group of people. It doesn't split them into two different groups. It collects one group of people, it measures them on some kind of dependent variable, and then it compares that the characteristics of this sample to some known criterion that you've set as a researcher. So for example, I'll refer to this throughout this presentation. Let's imagine that there's a researcher named Sherry. Sherry wonders if ovulating women's temperatures differ from normal body temperature when they're ovulating. Now, there's actually quite a bit of science behind that in research already. It turns out that actually when a woman is ovulating, her body temperature does increase ever so slightly, but it is measurable. It increases by maybe, I think it's about a fourth of a degree or something like that. So that's kind of the thing. The point here is that Sherry doesn't have to sort of get a separate sample to test what normal body temperature is, like a group of people who are not ovulating, a group of women who are not ovulating. She doesn't need to do that necessarily because we know what normal body temperature is. Normal body temperature is, of course, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And so she doesn't need to waste the time and resources establishing what is normal body temperature. Instead, she could just get a single group of women who are ovulating and check their body temperatures with a sensitive thermometer and then test it against 98.6. Okay, so this is one reason why we may want to calculate a one sample t-value, is that you just want to contrast your data with some known set of data. It also might be that maybe you want to contrast it with some previous research perhaps, but they didn't disclose their standard deviation or their number of observations, and so you can't put it into an independent samples t-test. This is a real scenario. In fact, this happened to me on my dissertation. Well, actually, there's a follow-up study to my dissertation. I used the data from my dissertation, and I had sort of constructed some of the measures from something a previous researcher had done. And so I was going back and thinking about it, and I thought, well, I now have a new sample, and it's been 15 years since they collected their sample. Why don't I compare what I found to what they found 15 years ago? And it was a very good study that the researchers had done, but they didn't disclose their standard deviation in their study. And so at this point, I couldn't now treat them as independent samples and put it in that kind of calculation because you need the standard deviation from both samples. So because I couldn't do that, I used a one sample t-test and just said, well, they said, for example, that they had worked 6 hours, and I want to see if my sample differs from 6 hours now, right? And so there may be something like that. It also could be that the violations of a t-test were violated, and so therefore an independent samples t-test wouldn't be appropriate, or maybe a dependent samples t-test wouldn't be appropriate either, and so therefore a one sample t-test might be appropriate where you have this known criterion against which you want to test this. Okay, yeah, and it also just could be that you have no resources to collect a second sample, and you just want to test out a theoretical model, for example. That's maybe a weaker design, but it's of course possible. There are of course other reasons for that. These are the ones that I think would be the most relevant, however. Okay, let's cover the assumptions. In other words, these are what the one sample t-test equation assumes are true. So it's up to you as a researcher to ensure that these are true also. They're actually very similar to the independent samples and dependent samples t equation assumptions. First of all, that there's a normal distribution of this dependent variable. In other words, it's relatively bell-shaped. If nothing else, it's mound-shaped, not overly platycritic, not overly skewed, not overly leptocritic, things like that. Now, of course, there are formal tests that you can do to determine whether it is different from normal. It's a little beyond what we're doing here, a little more advanced, so that's fine. Just you can graph it and see if it's all that different, right? It also assumes that the sample was randomly selected. Now that's pretty important, especially if you're comparing it against what is known to be sort of the gold standard, for example, because the gold standard is essentially the population's value. For example, body temperature is established using the population of human beings, right? So if I don't randomly sample my particular group, that could be a problem. Now, in this case that I talked about ovulating women, that's fine as long as the ovulating women are randomly selected among ovulating women, right? If I were to just pick ovulating women of a certain age, just pick ovulating women of a certain geographic location even, or that share genes otherwise, for example, just sisters, that might be a problem because there are things there, it's introducing perhaps variables that I'm not controlling for otherwise. So that, of course, might be a problem. And then, of course, the third assumption is independence of observations. In other words, the people that I am measuring this thing on aren't influencing each other on their particular variable. Now, in this case, because ovulation probably isn't a socially controlled kind of thing, it seems safe to assume that if this were my example, the observations would be independent of one another. Let's take a look at the equation now. This is very much similar to the dependent samples T equation, as you'll see here in just a moment if you've been following these videos along. Here's what it is. Now, we actually already have all of this, right? We already know how to get all of this. This is very easy to get, and we get it almost the same way that we got from the dependent samples equation. The major difference here is, of course, that we're obtaining all of this information from just a single sample. In other words, we're not calculating a difference score as we are in a dependent samples equation, and it's not two different groups like it would be in an independent samples equation. So the calculations here are actually quite a bit easier than in either of those others. The only thing that we don't obtain from the one sample here is, of course, this little Greek letter mu. Mu, of course, refers to the population value of x that we're expecting, our variable x. In this case, we're calling it body temperature. So, of course, the population value of x that I'd be expecting in this little scenario would be 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, let's cover the hypotheses now. So the null and alternative hypotheses are actually very similar to the dependent samples value as well, or the dependent samples hypotheses as well. Our default, of course, is that there's no difference here, that there's no effect whatsoever of the thing we're measuring on this other thing that we're measuring, on our dependent variable. And so we're essentially suggesting that it's the exact same. We're finding no difference in the group we sampled compared to the criterion that we set. So in this case, it would be, we don't think that ovulating women's body temperature actually does differ from normal body temperature. Okay, and that would look like this. What we're saying is the mean of our sample does not differ in any way from the population mean. Okay. And the alternative is, of course, that it is different. So you could say it's different from the set criterion. The alternative that I will accept only if there's strong enough evidence is that the mean of my sample actually does differ from the population in some meaningful way. Now, you could also specify the direction. You could do a one-tailed, one-sample test criterion. So in other words, if I want to say for sure, I really don't think I'm going to find ovulating women's body temperature any lower, but I want to increase that sensitivity to just find if it is higher. If it is lower, I'm not going to find anything interesting here, but if it is higher, I want to be able to see that. You could specify that with what is called a directional hypothesis, or a one-tailed test criterion is what you would use. So in this case, if I do think that ovulating women's body temperature is slightly higher than the average, I would go along with this alternative hypothesis, specify my direction, and that would indicate it's a one-tailed test. But in other scenarios where you might expect it to be smaller, in this case body temperature, we probably wouldn't, but in something else you could use the other one if it's appropriate. If you're not sure, talk to somebody who's familiar with this, think it through carefully, and you'll get there. Okay, so really quick recap of what we've done here. A one-tailed test is looking at just a single sample at a single time and contrasts that sample's characteristics, specifically the mean and standard deviation, with some set criterion and says, is that different enough from that particular criterion that I can say it's a meaningful difference, right? That's all we're really doing. And so that will give us our statistical significance and tell us which hypothesis we can support or which one we should reject. And that's pretty much it. So we will calculate this in the next video, and then of course we'll do the interpretation following that. I'll see you then.